So we're thrilled to kick off CIO Chat Live 3.0. We're doing it again this year in virtual mode, but I'll talk a little bit later about getting back to doing in-person sessions next year. In terms of our plan for today, I'm going to do just a few seconds of introductions, and then we'll get into panels, and then we'll do a update on our scholarship and mentorship program, which I'm really thrilled to be sharing with you more on today. Actually, Jason James, who's taken that on, and I couldn't do it without him, has agreed to share today on what we're doing there. And then we'll do a review of what we're planning to do in 2022. So for those who don't know, CIO Chat, I give all the credit to the founding folks here, and that's John Dodge at IDG CIO Magazine, actually started the CIO Chat. I took it over about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's become a labor of love for me. For those who haven't participated, we have our Twitter chat on Thursdays from 2 to 3. We're just right now working through the agenda for the next quarter, where we get to discuss important things. So please do join us on Thursdays. You can come for as little as 10 to 15 minutes, and some people like to share later. It's great to have a community that can share on how to be an effective CIO in an increasingly digital era. In terms of the organization, we actually became an official organization in 2019 as a nonprofit 501c3. We're focused on a couple of things. The first thing is CIO education. This is an example of that, as well as the weekly chats that we do. And then the second thing, which we're really excited about, is STEM diversity scholarships, mentorships, and internships. And Jason James will be speaking about that a little bit later. And then, lastly, just again, one more thanks for our sponsors that enabled us to do this virtual event today. This is our board. I get a lot of guidance and thinking from all of those folks that are involved. We're going to make one addition, as I promised Jay Farrow, to the list, so I'm going to have to squeeze everybody down a little bit, but everybody is really incredibly helpful to bringing a great event for you that helps people who are leading in technology actually figure out how to do the people, process, and technology elements. So I just wanted to share our board quickly with you today. And with that, I'm ready to get us into our first panel. What I'm going to do right now is to stop sharing. One more thing, I want to show who our first panel is. So Heino, I hope I pronounced your first name right. Is going to lead us off, and he's got a very distinguished panel here. You can see all the folks, and what I'm going to do, as I said, I'll stop sharing the screen, and if everybody who's on the panel could come off of mute and show your pictures, then I'll let Heino provide an introduction to everybody, and if I've said his name correctly, correct me on that, and we'll go from start with the first panel. So let me stop my share, and I'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, thank you, Miles. My pronunciation were excellent, and thank you for inviting me to facilitate and to moderate the first panel. I'm happy to be here. Honestly, I'm really proud because I assume I'm one of the few European participants in this panel or in this meeting for the next hours. Therefore, I'm confident that we'll get some insights from the other side of the Atlantic. First of all, I would like to do a short round of introduction of all the panelists of the first panel, and then we go into the discussion. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Heino Hüttner. In Germany, I'm the head of CIO advisory services at Capgemini. Capgemini is one of the largest IT system integrators, I would say, in the world. We have a focus really from application development, IT strategy, And based on the acquisition of Altran last year, we are, I would say, one of the leaders of industrial in the area of Internet of Things. My team is responsible to provide advisory services for IT managers for our key customers. And yeah, I work daily with different industries and with different customers. And yeah, I have experience in this area as well, probably like you. And I'm happy to facilitate this panel. And first of all, I would like to introduce Rachel Clements. She's thought leader and CIO and vice president from a tech research company. And Rachel, it would be great if you tell something from your side and maybe something of your first experience about the last 12 months regarding your new normal.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Rachel. Everybody calls me Ray. I am a former CIO, actually, not currently a CIO. I'm VP of Industry Relations and Corporate Strategy at the Tambellini Group, which is a higher ed focused research and analyst firm. And my first experience was as an industry analyst, sort of watching what was happening in real time with the industry, with higher education, as we saw institutions start to think about this as like a theoretical disaster recovery or a business continuity exercise, and sort of what if and what would be coming. And then it seemed like almost on a daily or every other day basis, there were these huge sort of sweeping changes. You would see one institution do something and then 400 would do something. And over a very rapid period of time, over a couple of weeks, we saw everybody go remote for learning and for work, which is, for those who understand higher education, just unbelievable that it happened and that it happened so well, because it's not a typically fast moving industry. So that was sort of my first gut reaction and experience with the pandemic.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Rachel. Another panelist is Isaac Skollich, a thought leader and author as well. And yeah, tell us something about your first experiences on the new normal, Isaac, please.
Well, thanks for having me again. Hi, everybody from CIO Chat. I think everybody knows me as an ex-CTO, CIO, and now running a digital transformation advisory company called Star CIO. My first inclination, quite frankly, is a personal story. I'm sitting on a plane leaving a client in Charlotte, North Carolina, and going back to New York, where we were my house is about a mile outside of the radius of where Governor Cuomo drew the quarantine radius from one of the first symptoms here. And I'm looking at my own business, running a company that does workshops and that does speaking and advisory. I'm on a plane almost every single week, and all of a sudden, all that evaporates, and I'm like, holy cow, I gotta go through a digital transformation of my own business and drink my own Kool-Aid. A lot of what I saw after the initial, let's make sure everybody has laptops and knows how to use Zoom, I think the biggest differences I saw were, number one, how do you collaborate when you're digital, right? We used to think that everybody's in the office and the outliers are outside of the office. So how do we change that equation, make decisions with most people remotely, collaborate, innovate with most people remotely? And then a lot of people struggling with workflows that never had any system of record, and we're doing things with spreadsheets and emails and passing the baton from one person to the next and big office meetings. And how do you make those parts of the operations work when everybody is working remotely? So I think those are the two things that I saw the most happening in the first 6 months. And then in the last 6 months, I would say it's really about how do you recalibrate to customer needs, and where the industries are going in terms of what people need right now to succeed as employees and succeed as growing the customer base. Now we're starting to get back to a normal course of business.
Thank you, Isaac. Yeah, good point. Make the operations running, keep the business running was one of the biggest challenges through the last year. Next, I would like to welcome Jay Farrow. He's CIO and investor board member. And warm welcome to you, Jay. What are your primary experience from the past 12 months?
Yeah, it's a roller coaster, isn't it? It's been crazy. So I've been at ERT for about 4.5 months. Prior to that, I was with a large building materials manufacturer headquartered in Atlanta, but very, very big, very, very large. And as a family-run organization, when the pandemic hit, there was this resistance to send anyone home right out of the gate. It was just something that I think a lot of us didn't have appreciation. Nobody really knew how bad it was going to be. And you're talking about a large family run, but very massive North and South American operation being asked to send all these folks home. I'm proud to say very quickly the executive team mobilized and came out of their comfort zone. IT rose to the occasion and we sent everybody home. And I think it was a great case study for the organization that people can work remotely. They can be productive. The business doesn't stop. And if anything, productivity went up and we learned a new form of collaboration and business was very, very good. So I'm proud of the way we pivoted. I'll tell you what, it identified friction points where we were still bound by on-prem or paper processes. And if anything, it accelerated our digital transformation significantly in a lot of areas, right? We were already in the throes of a pretty big upheaval and transformation. And I think what it did is it lit a fire under many areas. So I'm happy to say that IT was somewhat validated during that time, or very validated during that time. And it accelerated some things that we were going to do in 2021, but ended up kicking them off in 2020. So I was able to hand that off to my successor at that organization and to move on to ERT, where we have very similar challenges. But we're 100% work from home. We're a global entity. We have folks all around the world, and we are 100%. Not one office is open at the moment.
Yeah.
And other than the line blurring between personal and private, we're not having challenges. And I think it's a really interesting dynamic that there is really no distinction. And we're learning as an organization to take better care of the whole person. It's interesting. I was having a conversation with some friends. They said, it's embarrassing when somebody, his kid walks in while they're on a meeting, or a dog, because my dog popped up in my lap earlier this morning. I said, I don't think it is at all. I love it. I love it. I think it's reality. I think it's real life. I think you get a chance to know folks at a level that we've never gotten to know them before. You see spouses, significant others, kids. You hear cry. I mean, it's just real life. I mean, you're working with real 3-dimensional, 24-hour-a-day people. And if anything, for me anyway, it strengthened the bonds of our team. And what I want to be sure of is that we're very intentional post-pandemic, that we don't fall back into our old habits and that we keep that 360 view of our folks. And how do we do that? And it can't just be, we'll send everybody home permanently at all times and you'll have it. When offices do open, how do we continue that phenomenon? So great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Good comments. And you may notice I made some notes. We will come back to this.
Right.
Next and final panelist is Stephen DiFilippo. A warm welcome from my side. Happy to have you here. Ex-CIO, thought leader, and please share your experience from the last 12 months.
Sure. Excuse me. I've been working exclusively for the last 20 years in higher education, universities across the country. Everything from like the gigantic Texas-based university systems to small, little niche universities in the middle of the Shenandoah Valley. And I worked primarily in a strategic advisory capacity, but I had been working with one university exclusively at the beginning of the pandemic, and had been working with them for probably the better part of a year and a half at that point. And I spoke to my direct reports, and we focused immediately and exclusively on well-being. That became the sort of the catch term for the last year plus. And that is to make sure that the team, everyone has really focused on their personal well-being, the well-being of their family and the people that they were surrounded with as we all work from home. At a personal level, I've been in a consulting capacity for the last 4 or 5 years. So, working while I'm on a plane or on a train up and down the East Coast or from home or my backyard patio, it was not novel to me. I was very comfortable with that notion. The notion of work-life balance has never existed for me. I look at it as work-life integration. So I live alone. I don't even have a house plant to worry about. So I can work around the clock if I want without it feeling uncomfortable. So at a personal level, I was okay with all of the change. But what I focused on with my direct reports was to pay attention to your individual staff's behavior patterns. We can all look at the camera and smile and say, yeah, I feel fine. But it's how you behave on a day-to-day basis that we need to start to pay attention to notice if there's significant shifts in behavior over the course of the time once we realize we were all going to be working from home for more than just 30 days. And really start to pay attention to the well-being of the individual so that they could work at a high performance level and everything that Jay has sort of referred to and Ray and Isaac. So all of those things kicked in, but I really wanted to focus on the human factor to make sure that all of the technical components, the technologies were there. We had a very strong, well-defined continuity of operations plan. So moving students and faculty and staff off campus was not a big deal from a technical perspective. It really was the human element that we really wanted to focus on to make sure there were no lost moments in that process.
Thank you, Stephen.
Sure.
To move forward, I thought it makes sense if we take our topic, taking stock of the new normal and how work has changed forever. I think at the beginning we should talk about what is really the new normal and maybe differentiate between internal interactions with employees. But from my perspective, it makes sense to discuss the external interaction as well with suppliers, with customers, making business. This is something which is important as well. And then we should talk about how work really changed forever and what is really the driver. And if I read the newspaper for the last weeks in Germany, in Europe, for example, as you may know, SAP, one of the biggest software providers. And 2 weeks ago, I had a session at Clubhouse where the HR manager of SAP mentioned they focus on work at home, yes, but they would like to get the people back in the office as well, because they would like to establish a hybrid model at least. Therefore, this is something I would like to discuss with you. And finally, what really keep the same for the next years, maybe in the long term, how the new normal will be, just say, the daily business in future. But coming back to the new normal in the current situation, Rachel, is this correctly pronounced? So
No, it's Rachel, but feel free to call me Ray.
Okay. Rachel, how would you describe your new normal or your observation with employees, with colleagues, with managers, as well with customers or partner companies, for example?
So our work environment, the Tamalini Group has always been a remote first work environment. Everybody has worked remotely coming into the pandemic, but there definitely have been some changes in that, in that work experience. So as Steve mentioned, that notion of well-being, right? Because it's so much more than just, hey, I'm here from, whatever hour to whatever hour, but now my kids are outside. Y'all might hear band class going on right about now because I've got a trumpet player in the house. So there's all these other sort of things that come into play that are part of that. And so there's more, I think, a little bit more focus on as Jay said, that sort of like the whole person, right? We're talking about the whole person, but also just that concern over well-being. I also think at the beginning of the pandemic, it was really interesting. we had been as I said, a completely remote workplace, but almost all of our customer interactions were they might be a Zoom call, but they were all audio only. Like nobody ever turned on their camera. And then when the pandemic hit, like everybody was like, like dying for that kind of human interaction. And so everybody turned on the camera all the time, every call. And then I think that fatigue set in that we're all experiencing now. And so now you're starting to see what I think will become that more hybrid environment, right? Which is I go out and I'll take a call on my cell phone where I don't need to be in front of a monitor, and I'll walk around the neighborhood and have a call with somebody else who's walking, and it's only, audio. Or, sometimes we don't turn on the camera, or I say, look, I've got water damage. I had a water heater burst in my house a couple of months ago, and my entire closet got blown up. I have water damage. I'm not turning on my camera today because I can't find my clothes, right? Like I physically cannot find them. So you're not seeing me. I look like hell. So I think that it seems like things kind of swing to the extremes, like all audio, all video, and now they're sort of normalizing into that. It's okay to, sort of ebb and flow, and some on and some off, and reduce some of that fatigue. And I think that's what we're seeing in the work environment, as you said, with different companies saying, hey, look, remote's cool, but there's some value in face-to-face. So, how do we start to really think about a meaningful integration of what has to be face-to-face versus what can very easily be more productive? How do we give our employees their commute times back, and those sorts of things? So I think that's that pendulum sort of settling into the middle that we're starting to see shapes of right now.
Thank you. Yeah, you said face-to-face meetings have their value, and I notice a reaction by Isaac. What's your impression on the difference in working remote, for example, with customers or suppliers, with partners like universities, for example, or journalists or something like that, or do this remotely? Based on my experience, if I can tell this, a contract negotiation remotely is a completely different cup of tea in doing this face to face.
Yeah, it's a different experience. You have to read people very differently. I went from, for example, in my case, having 30 people in a room orchestrating a workshop and doing them digitally and trying to get the same reactions and read people's faces and understand what they're absorbing, and even being able to relate what their experiences are personally. It's a very different set of skills. And I think, many people, particularly those in higher ed, have had to learn those skills the hard way, and some of them are still learning it. I think it's taught us, to Jay's point, a good amount of empathy for what the people's situation are. And I think one of the big differences, I look at companies today, those that were highly digital, I think, their spectrum has moved to the right even further. They're more digital, they're more collaborative. They figured out how to do more things in the pandemic. I think there's another like 20% that are kicking and screaming about going digital. Those are the ones that are dragging people back into the office, maybe a little bit prematurely. And there's a big group in the middle who are still trying to figure things out. What does the new normal mean for working with customers, for working with suppliers, and working with employees? I think one of the big differences is that employees are not going to put up with command and control type of leadership anymore. They've been through hell the last year. Most of them have tried their best to continue to do their job. They're doing it at different hours of the day. They're on Zoom, they're not on Zoom. And they're able to move around to different parts of the country now. For the most part, they can live and work in different places. And that's giving them options, right? They can go work for a company that's outside of their local market, or they can change their local market. So I think that's going to be one of the more interesting things that we feel in the next year. As people come back, if they don't feel like they're part of their company anymore, they're going to go and seek out other employment. And in terms of the leadership group here, it's really about figuring out how to empower people and how to provide a real work-life balance going forward.
Isaac, a funny story about that. I heard about a public university recently who discovered that one of their employees was actually working out of the country. And the only reason they discovered it was because there was a technical issue with their laptop. And so not only do people want that flexibility, but it's also going to create some really interesting challenges for organizations, because state agencies in particular have really clear rules about who can work for the state, right?
Right.
And so that's, I think, going to be an interesting challenge.
Yes.
You know, what's going to be an interesting dynamic to me is the hybrid model. Today, we're all remote, right? Or at least most of us are remote. So you're on equal footing with everybody. So my team in Germany and Tokyo and Belgium and the UK and all over the US, we're all remote. I mean, so you have this kind of common ground. When people are back in the office, we're going to have to be very intentional about making sure the people who will need to continue to be remote feel included. Because it's easy, I think, to fall back into a habit of, hey, we're all in a conference room again. It's me, Ray, Ike, and NY Ike, Isaac, and Steve, and oh yeah, we have Joe over here and Susie over there. They're still working from home, and making sure that there's this included feeling. And I think we should be more cognizant of it. But today, like I said, it's a little easier because we're all doing it, and so it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. I think hybrid is the right answer. I love that the fact that the walls about labor have disappeared or are disappearing. The fact that you can get a DevOps engineer pretty much anywhere following state rules, but you can. Or federal, whatever rules your organization has.
Right.
I love that. You know, I made a comment the other day on Twitter, and it caused some consternation with a few select folks. And I was talking about work from home, and I made the comment, do your job. And apparently on Twitter, you have to define every single possible scenario and nuance to everything you post, or somebody's going to take umbrage with it. And it's, you have to trust your folks to do the job that they've agreed to do, and that you've both mutually agreed to do on terms that takes care of them, right? So when somebody says do your job, it doesn't necessarily mean 8 to 5, you do your job, 40 hours, that's what I'm paying you for, you do your job. It's, look, within the confines of what we agreed to, work-life balance, you have kids, you have a spouse and others. I trust you, Jay, to take care of business. You know, and that probably didn't come out clearly, but the implicit underlying current was, I trust you to use good judgment, to do your job, to be available when it makes sense, and to, you know, openly communicate, because it does require an extra degree of effort when you're remote. It's not, I can't walk down the hall and see Ray. I have to like fire up a Zoom or a text or whatever to have a conversation. So just be aware of that. And I think most people get that, but yeah, you know, that's going to be the interesting dynamic. I mean, we're going to go back to work at some point. I think ultimately at ERT will end up being hybrid, you know, some sort of hybrid, but we're still figuring it out.
I think from a university perspective, the concept new normal isn't new. So we're talking about hybrid, we're talking about remote. When you think about universities for the last 10, 15 years at least, there's been some version of online learning. So that we've been doing this in higher ed for quite a while. So students are learning from the Starbucks, from their residence halls, dormitories, whatever you want to call them, from home, wherever home is, their buddy's place, you know, their friend's place, whatever. That's not new for universities. What we discovered in the last semester that I found really fascinating, that is a little different, and that is, and it sort of speaks to what a lot of us are talking about, and that is that human interaction piece. So because of the pandemic and because of restricted use on campus, we had to reduce the number of students who were living on campus in our residence halls, excuse me. But of those that were living on campus, about a third of those students were living in the residence halls, but taking all of their courses, 100% of their courses online. So that told us that students, even in the midst of a pandemic, wanted to have human interaction. They wanted to have that college life experience, regardless of the circumstances, even though they had to wear a mask and socially distance and all that stuff. So it drove home to us the notion that students were probably in this coming fall, and once everyone was vaccinated or there was a reasonable amount of herd immunity, they want to come back to campus, the students do. The flip of that is that there were faculty who swore that online learning was just not good. They're now clamoring to try and schedule some of their courses to be taught online. So the faculty are moving more toward a real, what we're calling hybrid, than they ever used to be. Students are used to it. That's no big deal. And from an IT perspective, we all knew we could work remotely anyway. It was just because of, some of the local sort of policies and, arbitrary decisions made that you had to be on campus. So I agree with Jay in a lot of regard. It's really, we hold vendors to an SOW. What's the difference of turning to, an IT group or individuals and creating essentially a scope of work that they're going to be held accountable for? So I don't care how long you're sitting down doing your job, just get it done. But I think that the notion of a university is we've been dealing with what we're all calling new normal. It's been our normal for quite a while.
Yeah, Rick just posted something in our chat, how rich a face-to-face conversation is versus a Zoom. And Rick, you're so right. I have 3 sons, and one is a senior in high school, and 2 are at the University of Georgia, and they are dying to get back into. They're in hybrid right now, but they greatly prefer the in-class experience. Yeah, they understand that there's a Zoom component to all classes pretty much these days when they have breakouts, work groups, projects, etc. But they really enjoy that in-person experience. My youngest son had a choice to do all remote this year at his high school. He said, no way. It's his senior year. He wants to be around his friends. He wants to go to class. Now he's safe. He washes his hands. They have to wear masks. They distance and all of those things. And luckily the school's managed it very, very well. But he's been in school, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 weeks, the entire year, and loves it as much as he loves school. I mean, but they all thrived on that in-person touch.
I think you can take that, right? If you look at students and faculty as your customers in higher ed, and project that into any industry, right? What have your customers experienced over the last 18 months? And virtually every company I work with has some kind of strategy and has some kind of digital strategy, some kind of data and customer experience strategy. What it was 18 months ago, you had to throw out the door. Doesn't exist. That world doesn't exist anymore. We've sort of been in a transition year for the last year, adjusting to what people need and what customers are looking for, and how to make employees successful through the heat of the pandemic. And we're going to come out with it with a whole set of new rules, new things people need, new ways to compete. And so I think about a lot of what we all have to do over the next year is doing a lot of listening. And that's, one of the skills that we talk about when we understand what people need, is listen to not just what employees are telling you, but what does the data tell you? What does the experiences tell you? Where are markets going? And it's going to be very interesting over the next year or two, is which companies can listen the best, come up with their pivots and strategy, and go out and really entice their employees to do things innovatively, different than they were 2 years ago, and use technologies in a way that drives advantages, and use analytics in a way that drives advantages. So I think the next year is going to be very interesting to separate out some winners and losers in every single industry.
Very good point, what you've mentioned, the listening part. And I remember one word which was mentioned by Jay, that's a trust. I think trust is important as well. Rachel, what do you think? How you can improve the level of trust between 2 parties, between the manager, for example, to employee, or salesman and the customer on the one hand, and how can the salesman improve his listening? And I know the challenge is to get a meeting with a customer, because the meeting in the canteen is quite difficult right now. How would you enhance the level of trust, or how can you improve the listening process to customers, to employees?
So I think there's an element, I mean, Jay said this, right, of intentionality and being really intentional. Communication is super key, setting really clear expectations. But I also think we have to be really intentional about inclusion, and thinking about how we, and maybe not even inclusion in the sort of the commonly understood sense, but how we really think about, bringing everybody along, which is, our partners and our suppliers and our vendors and our customers and all those folks and our internal people. There are benefits, as I think both Isaac and Jay said, to this platform in terms of things like, I put my pronouns in here, and so we all can do things like that to better present who we are. But there are also disadvantages to this platform, right? So folks who do not have privilege and might be in environments that they're not super proud of, or they feel like could impact their work environment, turning on their camera can be a real disadvantage. So how do we make sure that we think about, those real intentional aspects of this environment, and be constantly reaching out to people and constantly, seeking that feedback and being open to understanding other people's experiences so that we can get better, right? Part of listening is actually listening and taking advantage of that wisdom, and not just saying, great, thanks for sharing. Okay, we're going to keep doing it the way that I'm doing it, because that's the best way. And then, when you do create those face-to-face environments, so I worked at the last institution I worked at was a 3-campus environment, but everything centered around the primary campus. And so everything was centered on the main campus, and the remotes very much felt like, lesser children of the institution. And so when you think about, how we build this hybrid environment, you have to assume the kind of anywhere, anytime design experience, and not preference the sort of face-to-face experience. So I just think there's a lot of really intentional, mindful thought with constant feedback loops, so that you can continue to improve and really understand what the remote experience is, what the underrepresented or lesser privileged experiences, how everybody sort of experiences that environment.
I think that's so true. And I think what this is teaching us is that we can meet people where they are, right? I mean, we can meet employees where they are, or colleagues. I know we don't like the term employees, but just colleagues, team members. We can meet our people where they are, our customers where they are, our students where they are. And there's a chat going on about some kids being more introverted. Well, maybe customers and employees feel that same way. I think what we've proven is that we can make it work. We can meet folks and show a level of trust and meet them where they are. And Ray, I just want to highlight something you said, which I think is such an important point. This pandemic has really exacerbated the digital divide, right? The haves and have-nots in the world, who don't have access to broadband, who don't have access to technology, who maybe live in a very crowded environment, or an environment where they can't just flip on the camera and collaborate uninterrupted for an hour. That is literally, and it just shows how far we have to go. And there are great, organizations like Inspire EDU and many others who are trying to get technology in these folks' hands to help kind of close that digital divide. And we have to be cognizant of that. And so I just love everything you just said.
Well, and also thinking about
I love everything you just said,
but also thinking about it from a company perspective, right? So when companies, pre-pandemic, when companies said you have the ability to work from home, and I have a spouse who does and has for years, that's like, great, that's a privilege. And so it's on you, right? It's on you, your broadband, your cell phone, your desk environment. But if you come into the office, like, we provide all that to you. And so maybe companies need to actually think about, how do they level the playing field for their employees, so that you aren't you can actually work from home, whether or not you have the financial means to do that on your own, as part of that policy or practice. So I just think there's so many little details that we need to think through as organizations.
A lot of new skills there too, right? We assume people understand what active listening is. That skill actually needs to get taught to people. We assume that middle managers understand how to trust and not micromanage their employees. Well, everybody's going to shake their head, because they know that is a skill. It's something that needs to get trained. And I think the most interesting thing that I've been hearing more in the last 6 months than at any other time is talking about business outcomes, and how do you, share what those outcomes you're looking for are. And when you trust employees, right, and they understand what business outcomes you're trying to achieve, then you don't necessarily care about the hours they're working, or you don't care about, how many tickets they checked off the box. You're looking for certain outcomes after that. And when you see those results, then you can trust people more. But all those are new skill sets. At least in the enterprise, we have to look at them like they're new skill sets and help employees understand how to behave through them. So it's the listening skills and how to manage them. And that's really around the trust side of things and communicating the outcomes that you're looking for.
So Isaac mentioned the notion of micromanagers. I seem to recall it was on day 3 of the pandemic, which was probably like what, March 15th or March 18th. And I remember saying, at what point do the people who are currently micromanagers start day drinking? Because you can't micromanage in this environment, right?
No, you
Right.
can't.
But that all speaks to trust, right? If you were a trustworthy leader prior to the pandemic, you were probably going to remain that way through the course of the pandemic. And if you were a micromanager, who typically they tend to be not very trustworthy because they're always, that sort of top-down strong style, they're not going to be trustworthy going forward in this kind of an environment either. So, but I just think that the whole notion of day drinking was kind of humorous.
But it is a conversation about inputs versus outcomes, right? And I think a lot of, if I think about higher ed, a lot of the goals and the ways that things are developed in that environment is very input based, right? Do you do this thing or do you do that thing, versus what Isaac said, which is, what result did you achieve from that activity? And if we can switch and help managers really understand outcomes matter way more than inputs, then you go a long way to getting where you need to get, I think.
I like the discussion about the soft fakes, about listening and the trust. But at the end, we need to think about the results. And you can trust your employees, your colleagues, and other people. But how do you ensure that the results are done? Because the people can tell you, yes, I work and work and work. But what would you do, or what would you recommend that the results are given, and you have the results, and the results have to be delivered at least. It's not the effort, it's the result. We need to be honest in this case. What do you think, please?
Yeah, I think, again, universities sort of have established that standard. So, and this doesn't apply universally, obviously, but the very nature of what a university does from an instruction point of view, students have to demonstrate their competencies, their what they've learned in some sort of fashion, whether it's a test or a quiz or some sort of demonstration model. So that notion is built into the culture of a university. And then if you look at it from from an organizational perspective, that's sort of a cultural norm. But then from an IT perspective, I think IT is one of the few areas, other than possibly manufacturing, where you can easily quantify the work that's being done and the time frame in which it's being done. So I think that IT, we tend to skate on that one a little bit, because we don't have to impose the sort of standards of performance that other types of work might have to have. Coders are the same way, developers.
Yeah. I think you can't go to your employees anymore with a 25-page strategy deck, right? No. If you're trying to get them to understand outcomes, right, we need to reformulate our messaging so that people understand what that means. What is our vision? Where are we trying to go? Who are our customers? What are we trying to impact? I know some organizations that come out with 3 KPIs and try to communicate that to 3,000 people. Well, those aren't relevant. I don't know how to make 3 KPIs relevant to my work. And I know other organizations that come out with 1,000 KPIs and half the staff is trying to measure them and understand them and reflect on them. That also doesn't work, right? So when we talk about outcomes, I think the language that we're using, the tools that we're using to communicate it, how we're relating to employees so that they understand what that means for their job, those need to get rewritten for this, environment where employees have choice, where customers are going to change their behaviors and what they're looking for on a dime. And ultimately, what we really need is a very vibrant organization that's listening and proactively responding. So I think it's going to be a tall order over the next 2 years for leaders to really express those things.
I agree. And it goes back to listening and getting that feedback loop, and then empowering employees to ask for help, and your team to ask for help when they don't understand. And Ray highlighted it early, being more intentional and not just assuming people are getting it, but offering, just being more proactive about how their role impacts those KPIs or those outcomes, and what they're being held accountable to. More often than not, people don't mind being held accountable to deliverables or to execution, but you have to make sure that they're armed to be successful. Now, they're on the hook for the level of effort, and sometimes we don't like saying that, but if we're doing most things right, we are providing those tools, we are providing that feedback loop, we are doing all these things, there is a point, to Heino's comment, that the colleague actually has to put in the work and execute. I mean, so there is still a two-way street. It's not some magical formula that if you do everything right as an employer, that every single employee is going to get religion and just produce at a high level. You can try, and you may have somebody that is just not going to get it and is just not a great fit for the organization, and you have to part ways. That's just the reality of being human and being on planet Earth. Yeah. So I think sometimes we forget that we want to say that, you're accountable, team member, for delivering as well.
I think it's, so Isaac just said something about like employers, as leaders, we're really going to need to learn and grow and change quite a bit. I actually think it's both and, right? I think also as a workforce, like we've come out of an industrial revolution that's very, like manufacturing kind of driven, and we're now in this knowledge age. And so I think that like living and working in a totally different level of ambiguity and with constant change. I mean, I saw this as a CIO, this notion of like, the technology, it's changing again. Can't you make it stop? And it's like, no, I can't. I'm sorry. Like that's just, like I get that the last time you installed a system, it was 20 years. Guess what? Now it's 3. And next time it's going to be 18 months. And then it's just going to constantly change after that. So that ability for us to sort of as workers really live with like more ambiguity, more constant change, more it's just a different environment. So I think it's not just leaders who need to change. I mean, I think it's the whole work environment needs to start thinking about how do we do this next level or this fourth industrial level of work, if that makes any sense.
Thank you, Rachel. We talked about the soft effects. I would like to know, is there any technology you would like to have to improve the virtual collaboration or the hybrid collaboration model? Is there anything in your mind you would like to share? Because at least we can talk, we can see each other. This is fine, I would say, but is there something what you might miss?
There's a technology I'd like to take a shot at. It's by a company called Oblong. The technology itself is called Mezzanine. And then they have a web-based product called Ruckus that is interactive, immersive across geography. So it's almost impossible to explain verbally. You have to go look them up. I have no financial interest in the company, so I'm not pitching anything. But what's interesting is I would have expected to see them flourish during this past year. And I don't know if they have or haven't, but we put one of their mezzanine rooms in a meteorology lab for our students, so students could participate. And using basically a magic wand, I'm not kidding you, a student can take information off of their computer, their laptop, and then drag it onto a massive, wall full of screens. So they can now be very interactive, immersive, and they can do it across geography. So you could be sitting in an office in New York City and be sharing content across the country physically to a place in San Francisco or LA, whatever. I find that really fascinating as an outcome of this past year. I wish more people had it. The problem is it's not inexpensive. By the time you're done building out a room, it's easily into 6 figures. Ruckus, however, does kind of the same thing, but on a smaller scale. But that kind of immersive interactivity, I think, is a real upside. Basically, what it is, if you remember Minority Report, where Tom Cruise was like moving things around in the air with his hands, they basically took that concept and made it real.
Very cool.
Jay?
All right, sorry for stepping on you, Jay.
You didn't at all. No, you didn't at all, my friend. And I love technology like that. I am a simple guy. I honestly just miss, and I know it's not everybody's thing, especially post-pandemic, having a drink with people and shaking hands. So if we could get some 3D printed alcohol,
There's a quote for
or
you.
something where I could, I can clink a glass with NY Ike or Ray or Steven or, Heino or anybody, and just actually just enjoy some camaraderie in the human experience, it would be great. I miss that, and it's not for everybody. It's not for everybody. And so we're going to have to be very intentional about making sure that there's no haves and have-nots post-pandemic, where some people just will not come back, and you still have to make them feel included. So I think virtual happy hours, et cetera, and team building is here to stay. But when you can't get together in person, boy, I'm looking forward to that. I just miss.
Jay, I'm with you.
There's a little irony to this, in that I was just having some back channel Twitter exchange with Tim and Miles, because what was it, 3 years ago at Dreamforce, we had the first CIO live we had dinner together, and I forget who else was there. I apologize if any of you were there and I missed it, but we were just chatting about that. This whole thing started out over dinner with a bunch of us saying, hey, we should make this happen every year in some fashion.
Yeah. I think my answer is along the sides with Jay. I mean, we can keep stretching what the technology can do for us for collaboration. And what I hope comes out of this is the reverse, that we cherish our time together. We did this experience together in person 2 years ago. This is going to be a great experience today, but it's not going to be what we did in person, talking to each other and sharing notes and just getting the vibe of the room. And that's going to happen it's going to happen in your office. It's certainly happening in university. I saw some chatting here about people thriving and not thriving with digital technology. I mean, teaching, learning is not conducive to 100% digital experience. We just haven't gotten to that point yet. And so what I hope is we find the right balance, right? When we're together, we find meaningful use of our time together, because it's expensive getting people on planes and putting them in hotel rooms. When we're separate, we find ways to make the technology just a little bit better every single year. We can't do, there's a couple technologies coming out that are trying to do the equivalent of a virtual water cooler. Can't do that in Zoom very well yet. There's a few technologies they're experimenting with. How do you do a brainstorming innovation center, with 40 people participating? Still very hard to do with these technologies. So I just hope we find the right balance.
Thank you, Isaac.
Totally.
One question regarding the future. We noticed that we will have probably a hybrid model. Trust will become more important. But what will really change the world of work in the long term? Coming back to our headline, Jay, what's your big bet? What will change the world of work?
It's interesting. I think, to me, the most impactful thing is the war for talent, or the opportunity to work across borders anywhere in the world. I mean, I'm seeing it in my organization, where in the past we've looked for people in country, we've looked for people, wherever they are, and now we're going where the talent is, and it's been terrific. I think that's a game changer, and it's been going on forever, but this just accelerated it, and it's I love it, because now no longer do I have to look in Germany or in Belgium or UK or wherever. I can look wherever the talent is that wants to be a part of the great things that we're doing in the organization, and hire the best talent. The other benefit to that, Heino, is that in the desire to hire more diverse talent, the pool just got bigger, right? Because I think all of us on this call have a passion for diversity and making sure that we provide inclusive, diverse environments. Well, now I don't have to like just look in my city or my one office. I can look everywhere. So that pool for diverse talent just got really big, and that's exciting to me.
Well said, Jay.
Isaac, what is your big bet on the future change on the world of work? What will last forever or long-term view?
I'm going to go in a different direction just to add a dimensionality of data. I mean, if we want to empower people to drive outcomes, we need to provide them data and analytics and self-serving technologies, the training and the learning to be able to use these things. You know, we've been talking about democratizing information for a very long time. Now it's the season when we actually have to put it to use, because again, what we're experiencing today is going to be very different a year from now, and we want our employees armed with the latest information about how the business has to continue to pivot. So I think that will play a big role over the next 12 to 24 months.
Thank you, Isaac. Now coming to an end, honestly, if I remember March 2020, I never expected that we still sit in front of the monitor and have conversations like this. But someone mentioned it was a roller coaster. But what is your key takeaway out of the last 12 months, maybe in the sense of the lessons learned? And what would you share to the other participants, Rachel?
I think Steve said it the best. It's all about well-being and putting people first, right? The technology and all of these problems is always the easy part. It's people. And so really being people-centered and thinking about how we create well-being for ourselves and for those people that we're responsible for and for our friends and colleagues, I think is the most important.
Thank you, Rachel. Stephen, from your side?
Yeah, real quickly, everything and anything is possible.
Oh, great.
A couple of people, I was reading the comments and a couple of people put in there, you know, that what we thought was not possible 12 months ago, remote work, is now very acceptable. So I think as simple as it sounds, it's everything and anything is possible now.
Yeah, this is a great summary, I would say, of the last 45 minutes. Are there any questions to the panelists from the other participants via chat?
There's some really good comments in the chat section. Really, really good, thoughtful, really insightful comments.
Really testing our multitasking to look at Zoom, the chat and the Twitter chat all at the same time.
We all looked very on point, though. We all looked very on point.
Yeah,
and Heino, thank you very much for being such a great moderator too.
Yes.
Thank you, Heino.
Thank you. Honestly, I learned a lot. It was really interesting. And for my summary, I'm from Europe, I'm from Germany, and what I observe is the majority of you have completely different background like me. In Europe, the majority of them have a blurred background on the one hand, or a background like me, for example, on the one hand. And what I observe as well, that it may be a question of culture, that the companies try to establish really the hybrid model, because they notice the pure work remotely mode does not really work in that way, because the people get more exhausted sometimes. The day is full of meetings and something like that. Therefore, thanks for your great insights, your ideas, your experiences. And now I would like to hand over to Miles.